So hey, now that we've seen all the cool things you can do with the time shift node, let's talk about the one thing it's not good at, and that is changing the speed. In this case, I have again my horse, and I slowed it down to 20% of the original speed and added a time offset so that my animation starts at frame 1. And it's a bit hard to see in the viewport because it displays the animation a bit slower. So let's again look at our version that I play blasted, and here you can see really clearly the problem. It tries to read out subframes that don't exist. And this is something the time shift isn't good for, but we have another node that solves that problem for us, and that is the retime node. So if you type in retime, you find a node called retime, and actually in other tutorials or maybe by yourself, you might also find, if you type in time, the time blend and the time warp node. And what I want to show you here is that all three are the same node, the retime node. So what the retime node can do that the time shift doesn't is it can interpolate between frames. So if you have frame 10 and frame 11 in your animation, then it can interpolate any subframe between them. And besides that, it can actually do almost everything the time shift node can do because it has a lot of options. But I don't want to go through all of them because it would take too long, but if you just play around, you can see you can basically just adjust time in different ways. So for example, by using the time expression, by using the frame expression, this is basically the same as a time shift. Then by speed, so you take the whole thing and just speed it up with a multiplier. And this is basically just a convenient way of doing everything we did so far. In this case, let's actually use the by speed and try what we did before. We slow the whole thing down to 20%. And when we run this now, you can see hopefully that it's a very smooth transition. It creates the frames that are missing, that are not in the alembic node. And it does that because by default, the interpolate between input frames is turned on. And this is very important. Sometimes when you create other variations of that, this is turned off. So be very careful that you have this on when you try that, because that is basically the magic tick box that allows you to recreate frames that are not saved. So very important, when you retime something, use the retime node, don't use the time shift, because it gives you much better results. Now, to play around with this a bit more and not just speeding things up or slow them down, let's look at a more complex example, because here we want to actually deform time. So we want to speed it up first, then slow it down, and then speed it up again. So what you actually know as a time warp, maybe from other contexts, maybe After Effects or something. So we really want to dynamically change the time. And for this, I created a little setup here. So let's quickly go through this and let's have a look what I did here. So the idea is that you have a very short burst of particles that shoot out here from a point. And this is basically like an impact into some kind of wall or something, like a projectile or something, that then kind of shoots out the pieces that are breaking off. And the problem here is that the actual speed is really high. It looks like this. So it's instantly over the moment basically it happened. And funnily enough, that makes it look almost unrealistic, even though it is actually realistic. We just used for movies that this is slowed down to make it cooler. So instead of this, what we're trying to create is this. So first it's fast, and then it's slow, and then it's fast again, like in an action movie. But first, let's go through the setup. So for my single point here, it's just an instant burst that is just set by a pop source that is limited to an input point, and then the birth is controlled with a constant activation expression, and then it gets a couple of initial velocity numbers from here, and this creates this kind of cone area that it spits out. Then there's a pop force in it to create a little bit of chaos in it, and that's actually about it. And the idea here is that we have something that looks a little bit like a bullet impact or something. So I have a box here that represents a wall, and then I use the output of the first frame actually with a time shift. So I'm taking the first frame, freeze frame on frame 5, turn this into a VDB, and then Boolean this out to create this hole. And then I just switch between those two on frame 5, boop. And in combination, this looks like this, because of course what you've seen is that I'm copying to the points some objects, which is just a sphere with a mountain. Now careful here, it's important that the copy to points is using peg and instance, because we want to retime the objects as a whole, not each point that defines the rock. So careful, this will create problems if you do not have peg and instance activated here. So all techniques that we already know, and this is what I try to do, not bring up new stuff. And then it's a bit of a fakey impact setup. So there, this is how it looks like. Not perfect, but good enough for our case. So let's make this cool. That's what I'm trying to do here. And for this, again, we can use the Timewarp node or the retime node. And in this case, what we want to do is we go back to by frame. And what I want to do now is, instead of using an expression for the current frame, because if I put this in right now, it would look the same. Whoop. I want to actually animate the animation curve or the time curve. So the first thing I want to do is I take, actually, when does it start? It actually starts at frame 5. And I set a keyframe on frame 5, at frame 5. I set a keyframe of frame 1 at frame 1, and I hope you see where I'm going with this. And then in this case, I look where my animation is over, let's say frame 12. So on frame 12, I set a keyframe on frame 12. And now I can actually look at the curve that I just created by just clicking pressing shift and clicking on my frame parameter, press H to see everything. And you can see it created an animation curve for me right now. Actually, this is not a good animation curve for this, because it should be linear, because it's, it's time in this case, normally is linear. So this is basically the curve that will represent the real time. So on frame 1, there's frame 1, on frame 5, there's frame 5, and on frame 12, there's frame 12. And if I look through this now, nothing should have changed, other than after frame 12, there should probably, a freeze frame, which in our case doesn't matter, but I hope you understand why that is. If you wanted, you could change here for the last frame under edit, under here, on the frame, under channels, extrapolation, you can go to slope, and that means it's a bit hard to see, but then the curve goes on here further, and then the time will go on as well. But that's another topic. For now, let's concentrate on this linear curve. So what I can do now, since this is the linear curve that represents normal time, I can change it to dynamically change time. What I mean by that is I can say, okay, I can make sure that the first part happens much slower, for example. I'm not sure why I have a frame 6 here. Let's get rid of that. I can say whatever happens at frame 5 should stay on frame 5, and whatever happened on this frame here, frame 7, let's create another keyframe with Alt, should happen later, let's say this, and whatever happens on frame 12 should happen much later. And give me a second and I will show you where I'm going with this, because this creates an interesting curve that should look something like this. So the problem here is it depends massively on your case, but basically what I'm saying is, okay, in the beginning it should be fast and then it should be slower. And this needs a little bit of practice, and I'm not great in this, but this kind of curve is now deformed so that something happens fast in the beginning and slower in the end. And I don't think this will be very successful, because I tried this a little bit. So it's pretty wonky because it needs a lot of time. Actually, don't underestimate how hard that actually is to make it look good. So I spent some time before in this node to prepare it, and it looks like this. So here on frame 5 again is frame 5, and then it takes 2 frames to go to frame 8 actually. It takes 3 frames to frame 8 to reach what should be on frame 5.7, and then it goes really slow so that on frame 54, we see what was actually originally happening from frame 6.8. So this curve is like an S curve, you know, like this. And, you know, it doesn't matter how the curve exactly looks like because it will be different for you anyway. But I just want to show you that by deforming the curve, you can get something like this. So first it's fast and then it's slow. And then it speeds up again in the end because the S curve goes up again. So if you look at this, we see the impact as fast, then it slows down and then it goes fast again. And this is, again, not easy, needs a lot of tweaking. It really took me a while to get this curve. It's a lot of trial and error. So here I've cached this out now. And now when I turn in the time warp, let's quickly show you that this is actually cached. There it is. When I turn the interpolation off in the time warp and I run this again, you will see that it steps again because there is no information in the cache that it could read from. By the way, this is the reason why in the file cache node, I haven't talked about this before, there is actually a substeps parameter. So you could save in your cache more subframes than just one for cases like this. But fortunately, you don't need to do that because if I turn now on the interpolate again in the time warp, then you will see it works even with a cache that doesn't provide you with this information because it calculates the in-between subframes. Now, a small addition here. In later versions of Houdini, you also have now a substeps parameter. And this basically defines, and you can actually read into it by just hovering over the name of the parameter. This defines between which subframes this retime will actually interpolate. So this allows you, if you have subframes, to use them as part of the interpolation process. And there are certain cases where it makes sense to increase that. In the case we just saw, this is not necessary, but keep that in mind. If you have subframes, then you can actually use them as part of the interpolation process. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.